Again, today I'm going to be talking about woodland storm damage and some resources. And you'll see down in the bottom right-hand corner there, we have a website, and I'll show that again here at the end of the presentation today. All right, so I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the tornadoes that we experienced here in Kentucky. They actually call this the quad state tornado because it touched in 4 different states, but a lot of that damage we saw here in Kentucky and primarily over in western Kentucky. And there's actually 2 long track tornadoes that touched down basically parallel to each other on that terrible evening on December 10th. And so you can see a map here, and there's been images that have been coming out recently, primarily through NASA, and you can see actually from space the tornado path that it took. And so you see that line there. I highlighted it, or at least pointed to it with those arrows. And so you can see, especially when it goes through those wooded areas, a pretty distinct line, right? All that is timber damage, right? That is areas that the tornado passed over and generally causing quite severe damage. Over here in this part of the state, a lot of that is farmland, right? So there's areas with lots of fields mixed with woodlands, and so a lot of farmers, or a lot of landowners rather, experienced some level of damage if they were unfortunate to be in the path of that tornado. There's also some new technologies coming out from NASA. This is NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory out at Caltech in California, and they're developing models to assess damage, so damage severity. And you can see this is from Bowling Green. So that was that second tornado that came up in Kentucky, just south of the Mayfield quad state tornado. And in this image, you can see some of that severity as it went through Bowling Green. NASA is working on a number of these models, and the hope is that we can work together to help assess some of the woodland damage, so the wooded areas that were damaged, and assess the severity similar to these more urban or community areas that were affected. And that's kind of the challenge right now that we're facing, is trying to understand the extent of the damage and how many acres were affected. And we're working on that as we speak. So what does the storm damage look like? Right? It depends, right? If you were, again, unfortunate to be right in the path when that tornado was a mile wide, you could be facing some very severe damage, right? Some areas that might not be salvageable, right? There might not be much left, or if there is, it's very poor quality wood. Other times, depending on if you're on the periphery of those storms, at least if we're talking about tornadoes as a damaging agent, there'll be some mixed severity of that damage, right? And so you can see in this photo, and this is a photo taken from western Kentucky, one area of the road here on the left-hand side was relatively untouched, where on the right-hand side, there was quite substantial damage, right? And so it's not evenly displaced. Oftentimes, woodland owners will experience a range of conditions. Some areas of their woodland they might be able to get in and manage much more easily than some other areas that are really difficult and dangerous to get into at this point. And we'll talk about some of that here today and some options that you might have in assessing those woodlands. So again, here's an area that has some trees. You can notice in the foreground and in the back, some trees that have fallen over. There's some branches that have broken, other stems are relatively undamaged. And so here, there's potential opportunities to come in, salvage some of that wood or that timber that's been damaged by different storms. Here is another difficult situation where we have lots of storm debris housing that's mixed in, creating very dangerous conditions, and it's difficult to get logging equipment and other equipment into these woodlands. And so these things take time, right? You'll notice that branch up here in the left hand corner, this is a very dangerous area, right? It's difficult to get in. It's difficult for a forester to get in and truly assess that. And these things take time. The cleanup is going to be extensive, and it's going to take time, and patience is really going to be your best friend dealing with if you are one of the more severely hit areas, right? But we have a number of resources. And oftentimes when we see damaged trees, whether it's through ice damage, which we have a lot of resources that we've developed, or tornado damage, we've got some forthcoming publications and other information based more specifically on tornado damage. But regardless, we see kind of common types of damage, right? And we'll kind of walk through these different levels of damage in the woodland and what some of your options might be. But again, a lot of times we're going to see a mix of these levels of severity with the damage. But first, it's important to consider a few things, right? And safety is always your first concern. And anytime we head out, whether it's after a major snowstorm or ice storm or a tornado, the woods can be a very dangerous place, right? And so safety is always your first concern, and it should be always the first thing that you think about before even thinking about venturing out into the woodlands. Right? Next thing to consider is what trees can be cut, what trees to leave, where some of that value may exist in your woodland. For some of those who have had significant loss in timber value, there are some options when you file your taxes to claim casualty losses. We'll touch on that. Depending on the type of storm, following an ice storm, when there's a lot of branches, what we call ladder fuels, and sources of fuel for fires, there can potentially be increased wildfire risk following some of these storms, and that's something to be important, or something that we should consider. I'm not terribly concerned about wildfire after these tornadoes, but it's always something that we should consider, and consider whether we should be reducing some of that fuel as part of our management. Right. And lastly, there's resources. There's lots of resources available. We have resources here at UK and a number of other, the Kentucky Consulting Foresters, KDF, the Kentucky Division of Forestry, others, the NRCS, that has programs that can help offset some of the costs towards managing after some of these disturbances. But again, safety first. And so we'll touch on some of those resources and some tips real quick. Right. So tip number one, it's always important to have PPE, right? Personal protective equipment. That's a hard hat, oftentimes some sort of eye protection, and if you're doing any felling of trees or bucking up, to have proper chainsaw equipment, chaps, and a face guard. I mean, it's important that we stay out of the woods when it's windy, right? You can see in this photo here, there's this branch that's hanging up, right? It broke off and it got caught up in the canopy. This is what we call a widowmaker, right? This is a term that's been used frequently for a long time because it has the potential to severely injure you or even kill you, because there's a lot of mass, a lot of weight with some of these logs, these branches that are hung up in the trees. You get a windy condition that can knock this branch out. It's incredibly dangerous. So when we see these widowmakers or other trees that have potential of falling or dropping branches, we can flag those and know that we should stay clear of those. And along those lines, get dangerous trees away from roads and trails that are going to be frequently used. So that's kind of the first priority in removing any trees. Right? Do not just go out and start cutting bent or pinned trees, because there can be a lot of tension in those bent trees. Right? We call those spring pulls. When you cut a tree, all of a sudden that tension is released and it can fly up and either fling branches or fall over in the other direction. And it's important that we're aware of those. Right? And I mentioned this before, those widow makers, always looking up, being very aware of our situation and where we're going. Right. And then lastly, do not fell lodge trees with a chainsaw. And this again kind of relates to that tension. We have a number of resources that I mentioned, more specifically focused on ice damage, but a lot of these different conditions that we see in the woodlands, we could relate to tornado damage that we see. We're often seeing similar types damage, especially kind of on the edges of that tornado's path. If we're looking right in the middle of that tornado when it was at its most severe, I think it was an EF4 level of tornado, there might not be a whole lot of salvageable material directly in that path, but we are going to see areas along the tornado's path that have been damaged, that some of these resources and this Safety in the Woods resource is particularly helpful when we venture out into our woods. And so what trees should we think about removing? Right? And it depends. Going back to these figures, some trees are acceptable growing stock to continue on, others are unacceptable at this point and don't serve at least any timber value or economic value. They could potentially serve other benefits or values related to wildlife, and that's something that you will need to work with the forester to think about. But if there's any hazardous trees, it's generally best to remove those. Again, we have a number of resources on our website related to some of these decision-making guides in evaluating the damage that we can borrow from these ice damage and apply that to some of those tornado, at least until we get some of the more specific, the tornado specific information out to you. Right, and so we have a main stem break, a major branch break, the bent trees, the down trees, trees that have greater than 50% crown loss, and those that have less than. And these matter because they help guide us on whether those trees will recover that next growing season and be acceptable and continue to grow and be a positive component to our woodland. Right? When we get a major stem breakage, like we see here in this photo, generally that tree is, it would be best to remove that. There are hazards associated with this tree, and it's not going to be gaining any value as it stands. Major branch breakages, right here, when we see a major branch broken off, this can introduce rot, decay, and other problems in the tree. And it may be a tree that you want to work with a forester or a consultant to think about removing, as this tree may not be an acceptable growing stock in your woodland. Right? Bent trees, again, these aren't necessarily terrible trees, but as far as timber value, it's generally best to remove those as we're losing value. And some trees may recover or bounce back, but a lot of times, if that's bent at least to a kind of a horizontal angle there, it would be difficult to bounce back after that. Obviously, down trees, sometimes there's a lot of value left in these trees that have fallen over, right? We can see a number of logs that are contained within this tree. And then we go back to the safety of felling a tree, especially one that's hung up in other trees. I would recommend having professionals work with you to get those. Severe crown loss. Right? We often say if it's experienced over 50% crown loss, such as this tree, it's going to have a difficult time recovering and being healthy into the future. If you have less than 50%, there's a scale there, or kind of a spectrum depending on the species and whether that tree will bounce back and be an acceptable growing stock or component. Right, and this is more related to the low and moderate crown loss, such as we see in this tree. This tree will likely be okay. Depending on our management objectives, we may choose to keep this tree in our woodlands. So there's a range of conditions that we see following these, and it's important that we work with professionals to help assess any value that may be lost. And so what if we've lost a lot of value, right? If you were unfortunate enough to be in that path, or at least your woodland was, and I've spoken with quite a few woodland owners that have lost thousands of dollars worth of timber. It's a really difficult, it's a really sad thing. I have a lot of compassion for those folks, but there are some things to help, right? Nothing's gonna immediately grow back your woodland, right? Or give you the exact amount of loss that you experienced through this damage, but there are options, right? There are timber tax deduction from casualty loss that you can file with your taxes and work with an appraiser to get the value of what was lost, and then include that in your tax returns as an economic loss, right? Or a casualty loss, right? And so it's important to work with a forester, someone who can appraise the loss so that you can get a numerical value of how much was potentially lost, right? And this is important too, because this past tornado storm was declared a federal emergency, and that opens up a lot more resources to claim these tax losses. And so if you've experienced a lot of loss or know someone who has, there are some options, including some NRCS funding that can help remove some of this wood. There's even funding to help replant your woodlands once you get this cleared out and managed. And it's a great time, if you don't already have a management plan, to work with a forester to start a management plan and get rolling towards recovery, right? And contact a forester, right? This is, I would argue this is an important step. They've got the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to help you be safe, to help you get any sort of salvageable material out of your woodlands. Yeah. And then I'll just end on this. This is our website. We've got some resources you can see in this tab. The resources right next to contact us, where we have a number of publications and ways to contact us and speak with a specialist, or we can help connect you with some of those resources. And it's kytimberdamage.net or kytimberdamage.ca.uky.edu.